must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Take your own advice. What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No collusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Jerry, find your hair.
Welcome to The Antidote. This is Greg McCarron.
And this is Jeremy Roth Kushel.
All right, Jeremy, I believe it is official as of yesterday that Donald Trump is back on Twitter, correct?
Well, I don't know if he's back on Twitter, but Elon Musk took a massive poll, and the votes ended up in the maybe mid to high 50% to put Donald Trump back on Twitter. And then Elon Musk, I think, reinstated Trump's account. Now, it's not clear whether Trump is actually going to go back on Twitter. He's made public statements about how if he runs again, he's going to stay on just Truth Social, but it's hard to imagine that he will not backtrack on that and utilize the Twitter platform if he can.
The temptation to use it would be too much for him. I could see that, but in any event,
I've had my disagreements with Elon, but in the end, he's a true Trump guy. He's a great guy. I love him. He's even better than Jeffrey Epstein.
And he's way better than Ron DeSantis. So this follows up, of course, the official announcement on Tuesday that Donald Trump is officially running for president again. And this is, and I mean, we saw signs of this beginning even before the midterms, when it became obvious that Trump was going to run. I mean, it's been speculated for about the past 4 or 5 months, and he finally made it obvious. There's been the signs in the beginnings of of what I call in some ways maybe even like a return to like 2015, before MAGA completely took over the GOP basically, and all of the major conservative movement figures, Council for National Policy types, fell behind and got in line with Trump and ended up carrying him to the presidency and all that, and backing pretty much every destructive move made during his presidency. I feel like we're almost heading back into that time period, but an escalated version of 2015, where you had what were called the never Trumpers within the GOP were very prominent. And I feel like we've been moving and heading towards this now for a few months now. But I think with the announcement and Trump officially throwing his hat in the ring, that it's becoming more obvious and clear that we're heading back in that direction with a lot of these figures, whether it would be within media, within religious circles in terms of conservative evangelical Zionist oriented wing of the GOP voting base, people who have influence within that community, and then even big money donors that were very influential big money donors who have been very pro-Trump in many cases. In the case of somebody like Ronald Lauder, a near lifelong friend and associate of Donald Trump's, a combination of jumping ship and trying to move away from Trump, but then also even in the way that some of these evangelicals, such as Michael Evans, have described it, a form of buyer's remorse about Trump. But I get the sense that whereas in 2015 and early 2016, a lot of these figures pre-capturing of the GOP by the MAGA element wanted to stop Trump from getting into office in the first place, I get the sense now in 2022, going into 2023, it's an escalated, evolved version of this, where now Trump has come into office, and while he was a godsend for so many of these policies and all this, he's seen as damaged goods or seen as a serious flight risk at this point. And these elements are adamant and very determined to not see him come back again with all of the negatives that come along with Trump. So I think now it's like a fight to basically try to retake things back from the Trump forces, but now it's just evolved with years of actually seeing the fruits of what Trump brought, and now the types of people who benefited from the Trump administration, like they like with hindsight, there was going to be an inevitable benefiting from it, no matter how much he was fought against initially, now are seeing the negatives of it and want to try to put the cat back in the bag, so to speak, and put an end to this. But it's going to be I think to do that is going to be that to do that and just try to get people just to ultimately just without incident get behind Ron DeSantis and move away from Trump and get behind DeSantis is the more stable next step of whatever bigger operations going on here. I think it's going to be. I don't think it's going to be a simple thing to do, Jeremy.
No, and there's two things here I think that we should look at. One is the key figure of what is Rupert Murdoch and his vast media empire doing. What is their stance? What is his stance? And it's pretty clear. Everybody, there was obviously even just a couple years back, right? There was a beginning of a turn against Trump a little bit. There was at the very least removing some of the blatant media support that was crucial actually for propping him up, that largely came through the Rupert Murdoch media empire. And now it's much more plain and obvious that Murdoch does not support Trump anymore. And they're trying to they're not only removing support now, but they're actually turning against him in a fairly public fashion. And so on that account, I think what we need to do is go look back, because I agree with you. There's a certain kind of a symmetry, or at the very least, an analogous energy right now to 2015-ish, I think, in terms of the media landscape, the political landscape. And remember one of the things that we pointed out about the timing of the run-up to the 11/9 operation. The 11/9 operation obviously ultimately centered around placing Trump into the White House. But it was way bigger than that. And I don't even think it even necessarily depended just on Trump alone. But one of the things that happened in the run up to 2015, I actually think I think it was early 2015 when Rupert Murdoch. Remember, Murdoch is originally he's an Australian national. His media empire propped up Russia Today's media reach in in the Anglo-American world out of his networks in Australia. I think that they basically put them on their cable outreach, on their cable platforms. I think is what happened at that time. So my point there is that this is much bigger than just a single individual. And we need to stay focused, I think, on what Rupert Murdoch signaling actually means about what is obviously a major political warfare operation. And we pointed out over and over again that Murdoch is a central character to the much longer, decades-long history of the undoing, especially of the middle American mind, especially the Midwestern American political mind, as we've talked about over the years, and how when Fox News came in a major way, especially on talk radio, and all of the Fox News hosts and associated hosts began to take over the AM radio waves, especially for like the drive time hours in Midwestern, rural and urban areas. That we saw a major result of that in terms of what has been described as basically the destabilization of both the conservative, but even the more moderate, like maybe more middle of the road, independent minded types in middle America. And so that's a crucial piece of this, is to pay attention to where is Rupert Murdoch and his media empire heading, and understand the much larger architecture here that goes beyond just the Trump and maybe at this point Trump DeSantis potential infighting, potential GOP civil war. So that's one piece. The other piece is that I think this time is resonant with the 2015 period, but it's also a little bit evolved or devolved in certain ways, and that the now obviously that there became a whole MAGA movement. They became a QAnon movement. Trump was in the White House for 4 years. He's one of, if not the major political player. People still basically say that he still is the leader of the Republican Party. I think that's fair to say. That's definitely where some of the energy is, even though there is more and more of what you're talking about certain GOP establishment types are trying to try to sever the Trump as a figure, as a damaged goods figure. I think that's a perfect way to talk about it. In a certain way, Trump is in the same position as the Jeffrey Epstein was, I'd say, after Jeffrey Epstein came back into quote unquote polite society after his first arrest and basically non-existent time served, really. Remember, and so there were people who still effed with, Epstein after that. Serious players effed with Epstein after that, but not everybody did. He was shunned in amongst certain circles that before might have, either pretended that they didn't know what he had been up to, or actually didn't know what he was up to. So that's where we're at, I think, with the Trump, for both phenomenon and Trump as an individual, is he is now actually damaged goods in a legal, not only in a social way, but in a legal way, right? And that's the thing that we're seeing now. But meanwhile, the actual people who might have been never Trumpers before, or who had expressed much more clear language against the GOP choosing Trump. Even think of someone like Lindsey Graham, right? Lindsey Graham, we can't support this guy. If we do, we will be destroyed, and it'll be deserved for us to be destroyed as a party. So think about where Lindsey Graham was, and now think about where Lindsey Graham is now. It's much softer. So there is some little bits of resistance, but I've been watching on C-SPAN radio on Sundays. They actually will broadcast the corporate news broadcasts, talk shows like ABC, NBC, Fox News, their morning roundtable stuff on Sunday mornings. And you see a lot of the hosts trying to get some of the other Republican leaders to really declare that they will not support Trump if he runs. And now at this point, I'm interested to see what they say today after he's declared, when he's running for president in 2024. And virtually none of them will say that they will not support him if he's the candidate. They'll say, I think, don't worry, we won't have to make that decision. We have other much better candidates that will emerge.
There's been a lot of, from what I've seen, ambiguity surrounding it, like particularly Ted Cruz and Chuck Grassley have expressed well. And I believe the two senators up here in Iowa, where I'm at, Chuck Grassley and Joni Ernst, have been what you described as not committing one way or the other, basically. Whereas before, like, they would have been much more gung ho about it 2 years ago, or obviously. But it's basically not declaring one way or the other what their stance is going to be on a Trump run.
Yes. And so we're at a different kind of situation now, where the people who might have been either sort of gung-ho for Trump before, or never Trumpers before, are really soft pedaling in a certain way towards a situation where they won't be so uncomfortable. That's the sense I get. They want to not have to actually potentially come out against Trump. But I think it's unavoidable that Trump is now seen as damaged goods, as a damaged asset, similarly to Jeffrey Epstein at this point. And of course, Trump, as always, the reason why he was such a dependable asset in certain ways was because of that counterintelligence acronym, shorthand moniker for developing useful assets in the covert intelligence world. MICE, right? MICE, money, ideology, corruption or compromise, and ego. And as we pointed out, that Trump really fits the bill he's sort of maxed out on at least 3 out of 4 of those. There does not seem to be some kind of actual ideological commitment or attachment or stability in terms of Trump's outlook. Although what's so interesting is the way then that he is framed, uh, both all of the talking points that are framed for him, but also the way he's framed as a political figure by like the Steve Bannon types is really all about framing him as ideologically pro-American, right? Ideologically a real American upstart who's dedicated to the good of the people of America against the corrupt elites of America and of the world. And so it's actually an inverse in many ways of what the actual, I would say, realistic analysis of Trump as an asset is. He's obviously highly driven by money. A lot of his self-interest in terms of his role in the White House was all about emoluments and all about using the White House as one of the biggest platforms in the world to spread the Trump name and corporate outfit around the world into lucrative ventures, right? Both before, during, and after, really. And this is one of the key scenarios around things like his taxes and those investigations, because they go to the heart of whether Trump can continue on with his moneyed ways. And it's always been recognized that there's a bit of an empty suit in relationship to the actual fundamentals, right, of Trump business. It's really it's a marketing effort. It's the Trump name. He's really at this point, very rarely actually the one who's really doing the building that he used to be much more involved in when he was on the come up. But by the time he's dealing with like Felix Sater and Tawfiq Arif and Trump Soho and all of that, he's really just the name brand for all of this. So that's money, right? And then, yeah, ideology. I think it's pretty clear. There's not really much principled ideology, which is usually is talked about in terms of like the way that the Soviets would recruit usually leftists in the West and in the United States in terms of a certain ideological sympathy, at the very least, if not commitment to what was proclaimed to be the communist ideal, or at least some kind of alliance with those who are going against the capitalist elite and all of that. But I don't think we actually see that with Trump. And then you have compromise, which is obviously both money and sex crimes at the very least, if not just like actual blatant criminality in terms of decades long money laundering via Trump real estate. And this, of course, goes back to why the real serious problem in October of 2022 in an American media context. Remember, Whitney Webb comes into the United States for the first time in 8 years to do these appearances that ultimately actually served a very specific political warfare media intent in the Trump sphere, really, in the ultimate MAGA sphere. And then covering up these aspects of Trump compromise, both in terms of the sex crimes that he was very likely deeply involved with for years with Jeffrey Epstein and that whole network, but also the money compromise that's not just flowing through Jeffrey Epstein. By the way, even when Whitney Webb was doing her interview with Tim Dillon, where she actually was focused on Israeli intelligence and cyber and those whole connections to Jeffrey Epstein, that she basically said virtually not a word. She may have said Israel once on the Glenn Beck show. She said Mossad one time in relationship to Robert Maxwell, but never again in terms of Ghislaine or Jeffrey, even though she has the goods on the entirety of the Maxwell clan. She knows the cyber history of the Maxwell sisters. She knows the cyber history of their relationship with the top brass of Microsoft and Microsoft's deep relationship with with Israel, and of course none of that was even mentioned in all of that. And then also, I heard her say on that Tim Dillon show where she was discussing this material that she knows very well, that she talked about that the actual split. She corrected Tim Dillon about the split between Epstein and Trump being about Trump disciplining Epstein about trying to recruit underage at Mar-a-Lago. And she said, no, it looks like it was probably more about the real estate deal. And then she says some oligarch ultimately, and in who's in the Russian sphere maybe ended up buying it. So she didn't follow that up with who is that guy? Oh, that's the fertilizer king, right? Rybolovlev, right? That's the guy whose private jet was then following Trump's campaign around in the 2016 campaign. So not just some kind of thing that happened in the background there. No, one of multitudes of pieces of evidence that show the potential money stream of compromise in relationship to Donald Trump, not just in relationship to Jeffrey Epstein, but these much bigger geopolitical forces that are very, very Eurasian, oligarchically based, and tie into actual Russian deep state operations, right? So that's compromise. And then ego is really that's the key one, I think, for Trump. Obviously, that there's a self-preservation thing there, an extreme, a sort of maybe criminal narcissism of some sort that goes on there, sociopathic in terms of even like throwing his family members and close associates under the bus to save himself, and anybody who developed him as an asset over many decades would know exactly that that's how you could depend on him. And just like any other intelligence asset, once they became damaged goods, which people who are potentially extreme, potentially criminal narcissists or sociopaths or have psychopathic inclinations, that if they let those things get out of control, and the bigger stage they have, the more those kinds of things that are benefits to you in developing an asset are going to become weaknesses, and eventually you're going to have to sever, cut the ties in a certain way, right? You're going to have to, your asset is going to become damaged goods, right? So it's interesting, the usage of the term asset, right? That's a financial term. So at some point, an asset becomes a debt, and then the debt it might be bad debt, and so the debt needs to be expunged in some kind of way. And so that's what's happening right now, that the Trump debt has built up to the point politically where it's intensely damaging to even those who cultivated him as a useful tool. But just in summing up, we're at a different place than we were in 2015, 2016, because it's been normalized. And that's part of the problem of the way that Trump's account has been brought back onto Twitter, because it's been framed not only by Elon Musk, but really a lot of those supporting Trump being brought back onto Twitter as some kind of question of differences of opinion or differences of political viewpoint, or people taking offense to a political opinion. But the actual history there, of course, is that that Twitter did not take Trump off the platform all throughout his presidency until people might remember there was a coordinated, high-level coordination of an assault on the Capitol with very likely insurrectionary intent to both overthrow an election, but also in the process to overthrow the government, to overthrow the legislative branch of the government in that way. And it looks like there might have even been high-level Supreme Court judicial partners who might have gone along with that. Obviously, if you're looking at someone like Ginny Thomas and all that, and now it's coming out also that it looks like Samuel Alito was actually very likely the one involved in leaking draft decisions all the way back to Hobby Lobby. It makes even more likely that it was Alito and his crew that leaked the Dobbs decision in terms of the overthrowing of Roe v. Wade and all of that. So it looks like there were very likely judicial potential partners in a potential insurrectionary assault against the legislative body, January 6th. That was not just some kind of protest that went wrong. No, that there's too much evidence now that has been, that's open source, that was the intent of high level perpetrators, and so that's that. It was in the wake of that Trump was then taken off of Twitter because it had to do with the question of advocating. And of course, with Trump, as we pointed out over and over, he does it in ways that are plausibly deniable, which both, deep intelligence operatives are familiar with, but even more so, maybe mob operators who operate in public or operate on open lines of communication, or make requests that are then could be plausibly denied as illegal in intent. But it was very obvious Trump was involved in inciting violent insurrection against the legislative branch of the U.S. government, and then in the wake of that, continued to, use language that was involved in inciting insurrection. And so that it was not about a difference of opinion. It was not even about a difference of opinion about the question of elections or election integrity. It was about criminal intent, and then how things begin to get violent, right? And the relationship of all of that. So we'll see how this all shakes out in terms of Twitter as a platform. Trump coming back. Elon Musk, I guess, has rejected bringing Alex Jones back, and he has seemed to have lost large aspects of the so-called independent right media on that, to Tim Pool and Viva Fry and all these kinds of people see that as a sort of straw that broke the camel's back of their hope for Elon Musk as a quote unquote free speech warrior around Alex Jones. But I'm interested in the potential free speech potential if Trump actually reemerges onto Twitter, where we then really do drill down on two different things. Opinion, meaning policy. Let's actually analyze policy. Let's actually really dig deep into what policy Trump actually pursued, outside of the fairy tales of the right about the best economy that the United States has ever had, versus the largely avoidance of large portions of the Democratic analysts and liberal elite in terms of breaking it down. That's one side of it. And then the other side of it is, let's have free speech about the actual covert operations, the 11/9 operation, and actual criminal action that has been to some large extent limited in hangout by that same liberal establishment, and then largely denied in a deceptive fashion by virtually all of the independent media, large portions of it, and virtually all of right media, including so-called independent media, has largely just been involved in pure deception around the 11/9 operation, basically saying Trump Russia was a conspiracy theory and there was nothing there. Sure, it was a conspiracy theory, but it was a conspiracy theory like most conspiracy theories about 9/11. There was partial truths in that, but largely there's a limiting of the hangout and muddying of the water and distracting from the hard facts that would point to who, what, and why. So I guess I have hope that we can get back to these actual conversations, one about actual policy and analysis and opinion, and the other about hard facts and law and intelligence operations.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm going to talk a little bit about this with the nature of and follow up on what you said about even the bigger questions, I think, surrounding like even Rupert Murdoch and Fox News Corps, that this goes beyond Donald Trump. And I think that's accurate. And I would say one example of that would be that look at the prevalence of Tucker Carlson on Fox News, as you talked about the propping up, it looks like, of Russian of RT within Murdoch-owned Australian media properties, and think about how Tucker Carlson basically serves as a vassal to promote information. It seems like in some cases it comes directly from Russian sources in terms of certain narratives around biolabs in Ukraine would be an example of that. And it's clear, like with the prevalence of Tucker Carlson and his ability to be on a platform like Fox News 5 nights a week, and basically, he doesn't come right out and say it, but he is acting as basically he's acting as PR on behalf of certainly of our Russian geopolitical elements, and then also in terms of he perfectly pushes the buttons, obviously, of the more weaponized elements of the culture war, or the war on culture, as we put it, and that goes beyond just simply the figure of Donald Trump. I mean, having like a Tucker Carlson in there, and I don't think that changes regardless of whether there's a Trump remains or whether we shift away from Ron DeSantis or somebody else. So I think that is important to keep in mind, and even the whole the criticism, I think, from Murdoch. I think the big thing that people have focused on was the Trumpty Dumpty cover of the New York Post the day after the midterms. Trumpty Dumpty had a great fall, and Trumpty Dumpty lost the midterms for the GOP, basically, or the red wave, the red tsunami, or whatever didn't happen because of the figure of Trumpty Dumpty, basically, and his endorsed candidates or whatnot. But even the criticisms are staying largely to Trump the person, and they're not getting into like these other elements that are obviously the elements basically behind Trump and what brought Trump in and the nature of what brought Trump in, both from a international standpoint and then also from a domestic standpoint. And I think that we're in a position now where some of these people potentially that might have been in a position to try and stop some of the to stop like a complete takeover by like these foreign elements within the Republican Party, such as some of your more we call paleo neocon types, or the more that we've described with this whole neoconservative split and some of their agents and operatives, even the Lindsey Grahams before Lindsey Graham completely flipped in the aftermath of Trump, and what looks like the fateful meeting with Trump on the golf course in 2017, and whatever happened there and all that, and Lindsey Graham becoming a completely new person. I don't think that's going to change with Donald Trump out of the picture, but it appears that some of these elements that could have potentially tried to like stop if there was even an interest in it. And I think there's a divergence of interests as well, even in this department, but elements that maybe could have tried to stop this complete takeover on a foreign basis of the GOP are now, I think, in much less of a position to do so. And I would just, for the nature of like even the benefit of hindsight with the original Never Trump critiques of Donald Trump, and of course they avoided the areas that really needed to be focused on, such as the obvious long-term compromise of Trump and the mafia network and Trump Epstein and all this. Obviously, all of that was avoided in Trump's long-range asset tree of Russian interests and other international organized crime interests. But as far as the critiques of like Trump's lack of character and his lack of principles and his lack of morality, I would redirect people to this symposium that was put together in National Review magazine in January of 2016. It was basically a Never Trump symposium of conservative media and activist voices. And I mean, put your opinions aside of some of the people that are featured in this symposium. And you've got Bill Kristol, who remained a Never Trumper the whole time. Then you've got people who went along with Trump eventually, like Dana Lash and Michael Mukasey, the former attorney general, are represented in here, among other names. And there's a number of them. Glenn Beck's in there. Of course, we talked about Glenn Beck and Whitney Webb. Glenn Beck's in there as a Never Trump voice. But the criticisms of like Trump and his lack of character and his lack of are very spot on, I would say. And a lot of that was dismissed as part of the, and even I would saw it this way at one point to an extent, that this was just the establishment trying to stop Trump because he's a threat to like the elite, the establishment agenda or whatnot, and but ultimately, with hindsight, it was a very, I think, accurate description of the the character flaws, to say the least, of Donald Trump, and at worst, the absolute non-character that exists within the persona of Donald Trump. So I would, it's very interesting to look at that with the benefit of hindsight, almost 7 years later, and like that almost was like one of the last ditch serious efforts to try and stop this man from like taking over the party and becoming the nominee and ultimately the president. But then that failed, and it seems like by and large, a lot of the people, even the people featured in this Never Trump symposium, fell in with Donald Trump. And I think now, like, even if the consensus has shifted away from Trump in certain circles, that there's still moving away from this bigger agenda that's at play, I think is going to be much harder to for people to divorce themselves from. And I think the other thing I want to say here also is that the some of the original Never Trumpers are reverting back to form in this regard, in terms of like the people who were critics of his in the first place. They're reverting back to form maybe now in a changed political landscape where this, like the elements behind Trump and the people who brought Trump in and all that have actually taken over, all the way from the Russian element to maybe even like the Breitbart wing, so to speak, with the Death Star and all of the as you called it, Jeremy, and all of the consequences that came with that, and even Brexit, which led into 11/9, and all the consequences coming out of that. You are seeing a reverting to form by some of these people back to where they might have been in 2015, 2016. That Trump is detrimental at this point, and he's used up, and we've gotten all we can out of him, and we can't go back to him again. We have to look to someone else to take the mantle. So I think, but then also there's this other element that, and we talked about this with the even with the political forces within maybe the more Council for National Policy type of GOP establishment circles. I mean, think of your Ken Blackwell types. You'd be a good example of the man who, as the Attorney General in Ohio in 2004, was, or Secretary of State. I'm sorry, Secretary of State in Ohio in 2004 was so instrumental in the 2004 election chicanery shenanigans. He was a never Trumper, but I think with a Blackwell, I think it was less about like the fear of like certainly the domestic consequences of like Trump, but more or less the idea that this guy there was an instability around him, and we don't know if he could be relied upon or whatnot. But then once like the machine got into gear behind Trump, then like these forces did. But within this whole like these elements of like Council for National Policy, evangelical intersection of the culture war and the neocon overseas wars, which you might call this is like where we get the split between the what we call the paleo neocons and the new neocons. And these are the neo neocons, or in a lot of cases they're the culture war hawks. And a lot of these elements are not so much opposed to even the elements that brought us Trumpism, but are more than happy to move along with never really against it in the first place. That's, I think, more against the persona of Trump, and that this guy might not be a good vehicle to get behind until he ultimately did become a good vehicle to get behind. But and that I think is represented even within like the Bannon strains that I get the sense are going to remain behind Trump as time goes on here. Or even Alex Jones, who's been totally brought into the Steve Bannon wing now, he's hedging his bets between Trump and DeSantis, and he doesn't want to commit one way or the other, but he doesn't want to deal with his base, his supporters, his callers going one way or the other, because he doesn't want to deal with it. So we are seeing a heightened war at this point over like whether it's going to be Trump or whether it's not going to be Trump. But I think the agenda now, with the prevalence of just how of like the whole movement and all of the elements that brought us Trump in the first place have so much power now, and you have this combination of this flipping between the Lindsey Graham type of politicians, maybe your Kevin McCarthy type of politicians. They're not the same politicians in terms of like, they're not where they once were in terms of their rhetoric and the policies that they're pushing. I mean, there's still similarities, obviously, but in terms of something fundamentally has changed with Lindsey Graham, and maybe to a lesser extent to Kevin McCarthy. And that's not going to change. I mean, you've still got people like Ron Johnson and Josh Hawley, and now you've got the J.D. Vances in Congress, and that's not going to change. And so we're in a heightened state to where I think even like the vestiges that may have at one point been potentially at a with an ability to try and stop some of the um, what ultimately took place, whether they wanted to or not, is actually, I mean, that still remains up in the air, but there seems to have been an effort to, and that's not in place anymore because this is where things have moved. And whether it's, even if somebody else were to rise up like Ron DeSantis or Mike Pompeo or Mike Pence, I find the last two to be increasingly unlikely. But if it were to be a persona of a Ron DeSantis, I don't think much is going to change outside of the persona. It's going to be seen as a much more stable person, much less volatile. Doesn't come with all of the flaws, and also in some cases doesn't come with some of the benefits of having a nonstop tabloid media covering every step of the circus that is the Trump presidency. With DeSantis, you'll have this stability that's in place, and it'll be a lot of the same, I think, to a very large extent with. Without the persona of Trump and all of the negatives that persona brings that you come to see over the course of time. And so I think I think that's where we're at in the movement has taken over and has gained so much traction that it's almost impossible to put the cat back in the bag in that regard, even if Trump is put back in the bag. And in the case, there's a lot of people who never really wanted to do that in the first place, and it was just a matter of, I think, Trump the persona in a lot of cases. And maybe Ben Shapiro would be an example of that. Although I'm still not quite sure with Shapiro where he was a never Trump culture war hardliner. So I'm not quite sure with him, but. To summarize what I've said here over the this word salad I've said here, we're in a heightened, different state than we were in 2015, and even if the Trump is put back in the bag, so to speak, the MAGA takeover of the GOP and of the right wing in this country is not going to be put back in the bag. I don't think.
No, it will. It looks like it's going to escalate, and the question is how we can potentially shape the escalation of this political crisis moment. I would imagine because there's gonna be a trailing indicator, I believe, in terms of the Democratic Party. Now you have people like Josh Hawley. I think he said after the election he was saying things like the GOP is done. We need to actually reformulate it or rebuild it from the ground up or things like that. So there is really at some level a grappling with the crisis within the GOP at this point. Now there's a bit more lagging indicator of similar kinds of things inside of the Democratic Party, I think. But I believe that that's also on the table here, and it will be under the guise of a restabilizing of the old guard, under the guise of a new younger guard coming in. And this is one other thing that we did want to talk about today, and maybe we still have a little bit more to discuss around the whole Trump DeSantis landscape and certain individuals who have come out in support, it looks like, of Trump. People like Caroline Glick, as you pointed out to me, Greg, at the Zionists of America conference, taking a very friendly photo. But I just want to touch briefly on the fact that um, that it looks like the older guard in the Democratic Party, the Nancy Pelosi's, the Jim Clyburns, I believe, as you pointed out in our last recording, are beginning to step aside in terms of their leadership roles. But in their place, they are at least suggesting that the new leadership guard are people who we basically know their political provenance. And it is very, I would say, Democratic National Committee political machine. And by the way, and this is a crucial piece of this, very Israel lobby, very APAC backed, very APAC centered. And you have people like Hakeem Jeffries, Pete Aguilar. Who is the third person who was mentioned, Greg?
Catherine Clark. She's from Nevada, I believe.
And these are all people that AIPAC supported directly. And so, as we surmised, as with the incoming Biden administration, that there was going to be a re-emphasis on this question of the U.S.-Israel special relationship and the Israel lobby, and it showed obviously in terms of certain
Jeremy,
positions.
Quick
Yes.
correction: Catherine Clark is Massachusetts. My apologies.
Oh, Massachusetts. Okay. And so obviously from Blinken's deep connection to the Maxwell network through Samuel Passar, crucial figure, maybe the last person to talk to Robert Maxwell, while he was alive, and his key fixer, potentially consigliere, through lots of other people who worked with Blinken in West Exec, the consultancy that was teamed up, that worked on behalf of Israeli cyber companies, amongst many others. So that was pretty obvious in terms of certain decisions. Now, there's obviously growing sense of illegitimacy in relationship to the Israel lobby in general, but AIPAC specifically, in terms of their backing of candidates who seem to have either denied that there was an insurrection or supported it to some low key aspect, and so this is being seen more and more, that the stronghold of the Israel lobby is potentially an anti-American establishment, is more and more awareness of that. There's also the increasing obvious internal tension that was created when the Israeli state targeted Palestinian American Christian woman journalist Shireen Abu Akleh for a political assassination. That's now non-controversial, even though to this day the Israeli state continues to try to wave its hands and say that nothing criminal was done there, even though, and at first they even did not. They were doing all kinds of really fraudulent disinformation about this was a stray Palestinian bullet. And so, if they finally had to admit that it was an Israeli bullet, but they're still justifying it. And now it looks like that there has been an opening, a very uncomfortable opening, by the U.S. Department of Justice and the FBI into the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh in Israel. And the Biden administration has said that, or Biden himself has said, that he didn't even know about it, or is proclaiming ignorance of the fact. And there is a lot of downplaying and discomfort that you can see at the top levels of even the U.S. State Department to even talk about it publicly. But this is a mark that there is growing sentiment amongst the grassroots across I'd say, the entire U.S. political spectrum, but intensely amongst the progressive elements, even inside of the Democratic Party, to begin to question the nature of the so-called Israel-U.S. Special relationship. And so this is going to come to the surface more and more, I think.
Agreed, and and then one thing I want to say on like this Democratic realignment, and I guess this is in response to the pressure. Obviously, Nancy Pelosi was feeling the heat for better part of certainly since 2022, but certainly since 2020, but also since 2018, I would say, at least, maybe even going back a little before that, as far as like her leadership, quote unquote, of the Democratic Congress. And I think that this shifting is uh, to some extent or another, a response to that, to bring in the younger generation. But what I think what's going to happen here is that this is something we talked about constantly during the Trump presidency and even afterwards, is that the Democratic leadership, as far as like these scandals would go, and it is that DNC slash Israel lobby elements that were very, even in some cases, leading some of the investigations around Trump in 2016 and what's called Russiagate and all that. I mean, I always go back to the persona of Adam Schiff, who was seen as the one of the leading investigators, but meanwhile, like obviously has got this obvious affinity to Israel, and like his son being photographed wearing a Mossad shirt and all that, and that's just an example of like the compromise or the problems, to say the least, with this Israel lobby influence within the Democratic Party and a lot of the politicians there, is that it keeps the keeps the political investigations from really going in some of the directions they need to go in terms of even people who may want to try to rein in quote unquote Russiagate. There's directions that they're not going to go in this terms of the global elements of it. I mean, obviously going back to Israel and going back to things such as the involvement of the Arab kingdoms of Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, which ultimately leads to something um, paves the way for the Abraham Accords, which has gotten all this bipartisan praise. And, Joe Biden can't even find the words to even slightly criticize Trump for the Abraham Accords are a wonderful thing that took place, and our commitment to Israel, and so it's a problem. And I think even the stepping aside for the new element of elites like Democratic leaders. I think it's just going to reinforce this around these areas of the lobby, so to speak, and where these political investigations will not go as long as the current mentality of like the Democratic National Committee and the types of people who will be elevated into leadership positions in Congress, that we're going to continue to, unfortunately, by and large, avoid these areas that really need to be investigated. We've talked about that so much during Trump and the depths of where things need to go in terms of investigations. And we talked about that during Trump, and we're still talking about that now. And I think it's still, it looks to be much more of the same in that regard, among other things, where we're going to just have more of like the status quo, so to speak. That is, in a lot of ways, has led to some of the areas that we're into now, as far as the long-term complicity of the liberal establishment in terms of the policies and trends that have taken place domestically here. So I think it's going to be much more the status quo in that regard.
And obviously, one of the key things that Nancy Pelosi really did over multiple presidencies, as we pointed out over and over again, is run cover to make sure that deep congressional investigations into the origins of such things as September 11th, the ongoing terror wars, the war in Iraq, and then the 11/9 operation never were able to actually happen. And I would say that it's pretty obvious that the main player that she's defended on the international scene over, especially in during the 21st century, has been Israel. It's very obvious, and we pointed out that she played a protective role in relationship to impeachment, in terms of Bush. Some of the burgeoning impeachment pushes during the George W. Bush administration came from such Democrats at the time as people like Dennis Kucinich, who included aspects of investigating 9/11, and what did Cheney and Bush, for example, know? When did they know it in relationship to 9/11? But also the Iraq War. And so this is an area that maybe after after Pelosi really has fully stepped aside, we might want to go back and do a retrospective in terms of the depth of these major criminal political crises that she was instrumental in helping cover up. I mean, the Iraq War has become so obvious, and this is still to this day the question of how the Iraq War was actually waged is very not well understood. And the question of the U.S. intelligence, quote unquote, flub of all of it. I've recently pulled up the Senate Select Intelligence Committee's retrospective that was ordered in 2004 in terms of the quote unquote bad intelligence. And there's a lot of information there, and a lot that, of course, is left out. Because you remember, this was put forth very plainly by Thomas Friedman, and he had to do it in, I believe it was in the Haaretz, I believe, when he said there were a small group, maybe about 25 individuals in this area. I think he was talking about D.C., many of them, if not most of them, Jewish, who, if they had not, been involved, the Iraq War would not have happened. And that's Thomas Friedman, right? Who is was a New York Times liberal establishment, a neoliberal advocate, and a Zionist too, right? And so there is a actual history here of what Nancy Pelosi uh, directly tried to cover up. For example, remember that whole thing that you always remind me of, Greg, of her with Chuck Schumer and Chaim Saban, where they are on stage and she says, even if the American Capitol were to crumble, then our commitment to Israel would be unshaken, right? And it's not clear whether she said whether even if it were to crumble because of our support for Israel, it would be unshaken. But at the very least, the language is highly disturbing for someone in that level of power. And then, but you can also look back into the way that she described Trump. All roads lead to Putin. No, all roads do not lead to Putin. Sure, some of them end up, many to most of them end up in relationship to the Kremlin in terms of the 11/9 Trump operation. But at the very least, if you're going to be honest about it, they run through Benjamin Netanyahu and the commanding heights of Middle Eastern powers, including the Israeli government, intelligence services, but also UAE and Saudi. And she was very, I think, a lot of her motive in terms of covering up deep investigation into actual long-term Trump criminality had to do with the question of the Russia-Israel relationship, and then also Donald Trump's long-term apparent relationship with Netanyahu.
Yeah. Where was Pelosi when Netanyahu was deliberately trying to sabotage the sitting Democratic president's attempts to launch nuclear diplomacy with Iran? I mean, among other things. I mean, Pelosi, but you hit this weaponized narrative within like these alt-right circles that, including some of the circles where we once associated with, for better or for worse, I would say for worse, that the Democratic love of and adoration for Israel is driving the investigations into Trump because Trump stands against their agenda or whatever. No, in reality, this Democratic this these de- the this devotion to Israel is directly impeding the investigations and where they needed to go with regards to Trump, because it actively undercuts the investigations of like all things related to 2016, the questions of just how and who exactly propelled Trump into the office of the presidency. The devotion to Israel and putting Israel such a level of importance in terms of constantly needing to protect and continue to prop up in its current form is directly impeding the investigations where they need to go, because nothing that deals with the Israeli role, as you talked about, is going to be dealt with. So it's an impediment. It's not the source of the investigations into Trump. It's not motivated by a love for Israel. No, the love of or the devotion to Israel is motivating the limiting of the investigations.
Definitely. And I just want to, before we move on, I do want to reference this question of Paul Singer again, and also again of the seriously problematic cover up that Whitney Webb helped people like Glenn Beck do in relationship to Trump and Epstein and the deeper compromise operations that was obviously being run by the Epstein Maxwell network. Now, then the other thing that just popped in my mind back to this Iraq War question is, how could it be that that this question of the Iraq War, especially since Whitney Webb's partner, Johnny Vedmore, was at one point he was helping lead the way in terms of actual fact-based analysis of the potential role of the Epstein Maxwell network during the run-up to the Iraq War. his work about what was going on with Nicole Junkerman and Epstein and their flight to the UK in the fall of 2002 with apparent U.S. senators convening there at a Les Wexner countryside mansion and estate, which is actually in the hills outside of within an hour's drive of the UK's National Security Agency alias, which is the GCHQ. The whole question of Catherine Gunn as a GCHQ whistleblower during that time frame, and then the actual nature of compromise operations, and the fact that is still left out. This is not just about money flows. This is about sure, war is a big money flow, but it's also a mass murder crime. It's an international crime, aggressive warfare, and so to actually tease out this question of was the Iraq War was it not just the core Israel lobby, virtually the entirety of the Israel lobby as a major driver of it in an overt fashion in the United States? And was it not just this sort of handful of neoconservatives, largely Jewish, all Zionists, that we should point out, that Thomas Friedman identified in Haaretz, such as the actual operatives of that scenario, such as the Office of Special Plans, Douglas Feith, the Wormsers, the question of Michael Maloof, and whether he was the one feeding Judith Miller, that is now sort of seen as the New York Times. Sure, it was the New York Times, the platform, but the actual writer, the journalist, was Judith Miller, right? And who was she getting information from? She was getting information from, it looks like, straight out of the Office of Special Plans, which was really like a aggressive warfare terrorist information cell that was set up inside of the Pentagon under Douglas Feith, deeply involved with the Israeli security state. Family members involved in settler, I believe in settler aspects, involved with the clean break white paper that was put to Netanyahu after he was brought in by the Arthur Finkelstein network. So not only that, but also the actual covert potential compromise leverage behind all of this that apparently included U.S. senators showing up in the UK at the Wexner estate alongside people like Jeffrey Epstein and Nicole Junkerman, who is then shows up in relationship to Carbine 911. So where is this actual analysis of all of that? And I would just point out that Whitney Webb has done some of the best journalistic analysis of where this question of cyber and startups and the question of Paul Singer, how he fits into all of this, that anyone has done. Her article about how neocon billionaire Paul Singer is driving the outsource of U.S. tech jobs to Israel, that she wrote in summer of 2019, is still a crucial inquiry into what's going on here. And remember, Paul Singer is then also could be brought into the question of the 11/9 operation, because it looks like he was the actual origins of the Steele dossier. And there's a lot there. We've done our brief analysis of it. That to me, it looks like that this was actually a question of leverage and information. They wanted to have a dossier, a potential leverage dossier on Trump that they could use in any way that they wanted to. It was then passed over to the Democrats and barely used at all. It was basically covered up. So he was at the origin of that. But also remember that Paul Singer and his Elliott Management Group look to have been the ones who are actually behind the ouster, the insertion really of this holding regime at Twitter after Jack Dorsey was, it seemed, seemingly ousted by the board, and then this whole other management contingent that seemed to be in line with the Paul Singer Elliott Management crew. And Paul Singer is unabashedly uh, a Zionist lobbyist. That's a lot of what he does, and use political money. And we'll include a link to the Militarist Monitor write up of Paul Singer, additionally to the Whitney Webb piece that points all this out. So I just wanted to point that out, that this is also here in the background, needing to be fleshed out, and it fits directly in with some of the deep criminality that Nancy Pelosi has been sure to help cover up over her many years. And often the networks are exactly the same who she's actually running cover for, in term, whether it's under the George W. Bush administration all the way into the Donald Trump administration.
Yep, and it shows that Trump, in so many ways, is not an aberration or moving away from the policies of before, such as the Bush years. In some ways, it's obviously bringing new elements into it, such as I would say, like the the rise of domestic instability and all this that comes with the foreign elements in a lot of ways, and then more and the more adamant domestic culture warrior elements of the that were in place during the Bush operation being much more unleashed in terms of like in the Trump era, and being but by and large, the Trump was a manifestation of the harder line elements within the Bush administration. Like it's what we've said so many times with the neocons and the split with the neocons, is that there were never Trump neocons, but the never Trump neocons weren't opposed to Trump because Trump was going to stop the wars, or was going to stop the escalation of the global war on terror and all this. No, they were opposed to Trump because Trump represented the more hardline brand that they themselves, the Bill Kristols and the I think the David Frums themselves. I don't know so much about Frum, but certainly the Bill Kristols and the Max Boot types, Robert Kagan types themselves did not subscribe to. And Trump was a continuity of the hardline elements of the Bush administration, both from a foreign wars overseas standpoint, and from the domestic culture war element of that has to be taken more and more into consideration when we think of neoconservatism and hardline policies of escalating tensions, both overseas wars and domestic wars at home. So it was an escalation of, I would say, the worst in some ways elements of the Bush years.
Yes. And there's two other things that I'd like for us to discuss before we wrap up this episode, if you're open to it, Greg. And one is the
Sure.
fact that after Trump made his announcement for president, almost immediately, the Attorney General Merrick Garland announced that he was appointing a special prosecutor to investigate the two open cases in relationship to Trump, one being the January 6th Capitol attack, and then the other being the classified documents that were found that Trump had brought to Mar-a-Lago. So that's one piece of this, and the special prosecutor that he named is a man named Jack Smith, or John Smith, who comes out of the DOJ's public integrity section, but was actually currently at The Hague, at the International Tribunal at The Hague, and tasked with investigating and prosecuting war crimes in the Kosovo War. And so now it's interesting. Some people are saying this feels like a recapitulation of Robert Mueller is now on the scene, and he'll get to the bottom of this. And but it's interesting because it definitely is a quick move by Garland to try to, at the very least, on the optics of this, and probably also in the logistics of this, to remove this from the potential political sense of him as a designee of the Biden administration. and people have said that this Jack Smith is moves fast, whether that is to analyze that there is not a case or whether to pull the trigger on a case. And there's a whole background here, maybe that we can get into a little bit more in the future. But this is going to now create a whole new terrain here that Trump and the Trump supporters are going to have to deal with in terms of ongoing actual criminal investigations into Trump and then what may come of them. And so it may be that there is a lot more evidence now in terms of potential high level cases in relationship to January 6th. Now, because Smith is not, he doesn't have his hands in the lower level, what might be seen as the lower level cases of the people on the ground who are being prosecuted around January 6th. But it looks like if there is anything there, then it has to do with a potential high level conspiracy in relationship to January 6th. And then you might expect that the potential of the documents. Now, I've already seen Washington Post reporting with unnamed people who are familiar with the case in terms of FBI and DOJ, saying that the analysis is now that Trump took these documents largely because of he thought they belonged to him as his sort of what he was able to do, an ego. Now, my sense of that is that that is largely a cover up, and that's largely a limited hangout, and that these documents really do point to much deeper aspects of potential compromise and international espionage in relationship to the background of what was actually going on in terms of the Trump administration. Now, some of this is just overt. Remember, Michael Flynn, and then even during the transition period, the negotiations around what was called a Marshall Project in the Middle East, and nuclear facilities and Russian involvement in helping produce some of this, and Egypt in the mix, and all of that. That was flowing all around as Michael Flynn began to lie to the FBI, that ultimately got him in legal trouble. All right, so that's going to be a whole new landscape at some level. Is the introduction of this special prosecutor, or a special counsel, I think it's actually is the name of it. So that was one thing. And then the other thing, Greg, was maybe we should just mention that some of the like key MAGA candidates, I would say we should point to Arizona. It was where where it seemed to have not worked out for them in the case of Carrie Lake, who's really like she is the darling, really, of the soft MAGA, the alt-right set, I'd say, in terms of Tim Pool. Tim Pool really was like pushing her. She should be our president. That should be our president. No, not vice president. She should be our president. And so she apparently has lost her bid, but also Blake Masters, who's probably the most closely connected and aligned candidate to Peter Thiel. He was with Peter Thiel at Stanford. They wrote their book together. Basically, he's similar to maybe Michael Ledeen to Michael Flynn in their book together. Blake Masters wrote 0 to 1 with Peter Thiel. And so that is a loss in their column. But the J.D. Vance question in Ohio, he won. And there is a lot going on there. And I would point people to the Gaslit Nation podcast, and Sarah Kendzior, specifically her analysis of a Russian sphere disinformation online network that apparently J.D. Vance and Peter Thiel are involved with in terms of waging political warfare on the United States in line with serving their electoral interests.
When you mentioned Carrie Lake and Blake Masters losing, I mean, obviously the Lake, I think, was a setback that she didn't become governor in Arizona. And Masters definitely, maybe to a slightly lesser extent than Carrie Lake, among like the Tim Pool types who you described. If all of these candidates that have won, like Carrie Lake or Blake Masters or J.D. Vance. And the goal, I think, is to, and I've said this before, and there were, with the GOP, that we're going in the direction of where the old type of GOP politician who was is going out the window, like the days of like what we're seeing as the quote unquote moderates, even though I don't think they were really moderates, but whatever actual moderates there were within the Republican Party, maybe going back to like the what was considered the Bob Dole days, like the Bob Dole type of politician. Forget all of the stuff with like Bob Dole's own problems and like the issues with Bob Dole aside from a long-term perspective, the type of politician that he was, like the bipartisan, work across the aisle, let's do business as Americans, Republicans and Democrats can work together on things. That's long gone. Even the not really moderate, but not hardline enough days of like Paul Ryan and John Boehner are over, and we're moving into a direction where not necessarily in terms of rhetoric and in terms of the way they conduct themselves, but in terms of the new political paradigm that has been set up within like the Republican Party as a result of MAGA. I would say by and large, we're moving into an era where the goal is to have the people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, not so much directly rhetorically sounding just like her, but in terms of the paradigm of like where the conversations are going to shift and where the policy discussions are going to shift in the way that the way that policy is going to be carried out in the future. It's going to be through escalatory rhetoric and complete unwillingness, even in many cases, to even see your political opponents as actual as people in many cases. And the more some of the more some of these realms, but at the very least, there's an inability to work with anybody, and the complete shattering of decorum and combined with just escalatory rhetoric backed up by escalatory policies that are going to just further, I think, escalate a destabilizing domestically is the new norm and the rule rather than the exception now. And I think that's what is being achieved with the likes of Vance coming in and the rise of like the teal of this particular realm of political candidate and sitting representative in these cases. And I think Lake and Masters was a bit of a setback for that, but I still think that this is in force. And this is another cat that's not going to be let out of the bag as time goes forward, is the difference in the type of candidates that are going to be put forth and promoted as viable national level candidates. I mean, just look at what happened with the people who replaced Liz Cheney in Wyoming. And all you have to know about that is Liz Cheney came out sounding like the grown-up in the room, which is a big problem because it's a member of the Cheney family sounding much more reasonable and rational than these people who wanted to replace her. But they represent like this new norm of escalatory politics and escalatory rhetoric and moving away from just this new direction of, I think, of escalated and hastened destabilizing on a domestic level of our political system and of our system in general.
Yeah, and in the middle of all of this, I think there's so much here that we're going to have to take on and analyze and deal with and deconstruct in many ways in terms of the actual uh, American body politic and the ongoing attack on it, and the desire to divide and conquer, to dehumanize across political differences or perceived identity differences, and all of that, in the way that the politics are being designed and architected towards that end. It looks like very much so, and so. But in the middle of all of that, we're going to, especially as the attempt to try to shore up the DNC corrupt establishment continues onwards. There is going to be more and more necessity to have a conversation about a actual political solution to this that I still believe will need to be anchored out of a radical middle that has an ability to work with those who continue to, do electoral politics within party frameworks, but also can advocate for beyond a sort of a post partisan American context. It's the only real political solution that I can see especially in relationship to the ongoing culture wars, the war on culture, as you point out, the war on political culture, even we might specify, to actually resolve this is somewhere in a conversation that actually can create a political platform along with principles that are full spectrum that can include people of different backgrounds and political perspectives, but where we can align on a basic few number of principles and then a basic few number of platform planks about what kind of government and governance we want to pursue in this country at all levels, local, state, and national, and then what our then international role as the United States of America might optimally be. And so this is more and more. This is the amidst the chaos and the political warfare and the destabilization, the radical middle continues to exist, I'd say. And I would say more and more are the necessity of our responsibility in this matter also is escalated. And so there's a lot here that we'll have to continue to analyze and work on. But before we go, Greg, did you want to say anything more about the questions of Michael Evans' public statements around Trump, or the Caroline Glick Zionists of America, or the Republican Jewish Coalition, Trump and Bibi, and all of that?
I'll take a couple minutes here to give a couple thoughts on that. Because this is something else that's at play here that's important with this push for Trump and the push against Trump. And this is a different salvo than like the whole Murdoch media empire. And it's basically the one of Michael Evans, who was this prominent evangelical leader. He's out of Texas, and I believe he lives in Israel, and he runs the Friends of Zion Museum, and I believe he gives out the Friends of Zion Award, which I believe Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump were both awarded.
And by the way, Greg, isn't he the one who is on the record with Isser Harel?
Yes, he is.
From way back, basically almost predicting Isser Harel,
Yeah.
predicting the
Yeah.
taking down of the America's biggest phallic
That
symbols
is
in
it.
terms of the
Yep.
World Trade Center.
Yeah, you're right, and it's funny. There's a bargain book section at my local library up here in Waterloo, Iowa, and there's Michael Evans books that are for sale. Books about countdown, nuclear Iran, and why we must protect Israel. And so he's very much an evangelical hardliner in the realm of Glenn Beck, but probably more overall, probably more serious than Glenn Beck in that regard. But that's who Whitney Webb, of course, went on with Benjamin Netanyahu. But Michael Evans, really serious.
By the way, Greg, you know who is in between Whitney Webb and Netanyahu, not on the full sort of premiere podcast of Glenn Beck, but Carrie Lake. He featured Carrie Lake and supported her directly on a call-in while the election was still being decided.
Well, that's nice. That's nice. No, I think Dave Smith was also on there recently too. Again, he's been on there a few times. So.
Yeah.
But on the topic of Michael Evans, and Evans is he's a power broker, to say the least. And Evans, along with another prominent evangelical leader by the name of James Robison, have come out very, very critical of Trump in the last week. And Michael Evans is, I alluded to certain evangelicals having buyer's remorse around Trump. And that's what Michael Evans basically expressed, is that Trump took us for a ride, and he did more for us than any president, or for Israel, than any president of my lifetime. And he did more for the social conservative agenda. The overturning of Roe could not have happened with the Supreme Court and all this. And so Trump created miracles, he gave us miracles, but also Michael Evans understands now that Trump took us for a ride, and he doesn't represent us and our principles and morals, and we had to hold our nose while he said a lot of things. And Michael Evans was in tears at a MAGA rally watching Bible-believing Christians treat him like a prophet. And I mean, I get the sense that this is a lot of smoke and mirrors coming from Michael Evans. But it's very interesting that this is also a dynamic that's at play with the with the damaged goods that has become Donald Trump and all these people who fervently and passionately supported him, some earlier than others, but all that got behind him are now abandoning. At least this is one example. I mean, I imagine there might be more going forward, but this is an example of a prominent evangelical power player. And I thought a couple things. We'll have to talk more about this. Maybe even our next show we can talk a little more about this. But the Trump response to this, I think, could be very interesting, and even how Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel might play up some of this is interesting. And I think it figures into a larger conversation that to be had about some of the other things we've discussed recently, like around Jewish issues and around the escalatory nature of rhetoric and of the increased visibility of issues surrounding questions of elements of Jewish power, Zionist power, and it'll be interesting just the reaction that'll come from a Trump that the Zionist evangelicals might be starting to begin to abandon him, and how this will be played and taken, and then contrast that with Carolyn Glick, a militant Zionist from the Jerusalem Post, Breitbart, David Horowitz Freedom Center, who tweeted a picture with Trump at the Zionist Organization of America dinner where Trump spoke within the last week and declared him like the greatest leader and just singing his praises nonstop. So that's an interesting split that's going to play out going forward. And so and then you add on top of that something we'll have to come back to, which is Ronald Lauder, Trump's longtime friend, known him his entire life, basically from the University of Pennsylvania to the New York Port Authority to the World Jewish Congress and on, coming out publicly saying that he will not support Trump in 2024. So there's some interesting dynamics and power plays going on with the Zionist hardline elements of Trump's support base, both from a religious base and then from a more economic, financial, long-term connection base of, say, Ronald Lauder. So we'll get back into that more, but that's a brief nutshell of the landscape surrounding that right now.
Yes, and it was interesting too. The Republican Jewish Coalition had created a list of their invited speakers, and Trump had been on there, but there was a question of whether he was going to do it and was he not going to do it. But then I guess it was agreed that he would end up, doing a remote call into that. But it was interesting that these are all like the sort of standard Republican Zionist supporter senators, many of them, and then listed as a key Republican operative is Benjamin Netanyahu also.
Right.
So
and
that was interesting.
Yeah, it almost seems like a courting of 2024 people to come to the RJC. Like they're definitely not putting all their chips into Trump anymore. And the Netanyahu insertion as speaker was very interesting with all those names. And also, Lee Zeldin is making a push to challenge Ronna Romney McDaniel for the head of the Republican National Committee. So we'll have to watch out for that too.
Oh, that's very interesting. And I guess my short take on the Michael Evans coming out against the cultification or the iconography, the religious iconography around Trump. What that all means really is that, especially for someone who's such an intense militant Zionist, long-term propagandist like a Michael Evans, that what that really is that those are the hardcore Zionists who I would say their real idol that they worship, their real golden calf, that is not Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a tool for them and was recognized as just a tool for their interests. Their actual recognized golden calf idol, the idol worthy of actual worship, is their Zionist, ethno-religious, I would say supremacist state power project. And everything that is the only thing worth idolizing and turned into an icon, a religious icon in their minds. And they saw that it got out of hand with Donald Trump, where he was seen as the second coming of emperors and Jesus and Cyrus and all of that kind of thing. They were like, no, we need to refocus this on supporting the actual golden calf. Not the golden toilet sitter, but the golden calf worship of their state power project. That's the way that I see this. As a simple power politics once again, but it will have very intriguing consequences in terms of the question of DeSantis versus Trump or the future of the Republican Party.
Yeah, let's get a guy in there as president who will simply serve the golden calf, not one who will try to make himself out to be a god and get people to worship him as a god.
Exactly. All right. Very good. We'll be back soon again for a follow-up episode to all of this. But thank you very much, Greg, for spending your Sunday morning with me. And thank you all very much out there for riding with us. Until next time, Antidote, we are out.
So long.